CityCast Pittsburgh is supported by Fulton Commons. If you're looking for a gorgeous co-working space with lots of light and some truly wonderfully funky decor, check out Fulton Commons on the north side. The historic but very well renovated old school building is deep in the neighborhood by a park, tucked away but still super close to anywhere you want to be. They've got offices and common spaces. It's perfect for organizations or individuals, and they even have a shared food production kitchen on site. So there's lots of food-related events for their members. If this sounds like your dream co-working space, visit fultonpgh.org to request a tour. Today on CityCast Pittsburgh. In February of 2023, just an hour from Pittsburgh, a Norfolk Southern train carrying a lot of chemicals derailed in a little Ohio town called East Palestine. There were fires and explosions, and there were all these photos of big black mushroom clouds being shared everywhere. A few of those pictures turned out to be fake, but the release of known cancer-causing chemicals into the air and maybe the water, well, that was very real. We're with the Allegheny Front's Julie Grant to talk about what happened 2 years ago this week, where all the rail safety legislation that followed ultimately landed, and how people are coping over in Ohio and even here, closer to home. It's Wednesday, February 5th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about.
Megan, I don't know if you remember seeing like the sort of a pile of smoldering black, train cars just piled up along the tracks. It was,
like just so much mangled metal.
Yeah, and it looked post-apocalyptic, I gotta say. It was kind of scary looking.
So take us back to that moment, the early hours and days. 38 total train cars have derailed, and 11 of them are carrying these industrial chemicals.
Yeah, so I guess I'll say the night that it happened, people didn't really know what was going on. I remember being down in East Palestine just to see what was happening. And there were people in line just like trying to, I guess this was Sunday, a couple of days later, people were in line trying to get information, trying to see, should we be leaving town? And then it was on Monday, like the next day, that Ohio's governor, Mike DeWine, and he was in agreement with Pennsylvania's governor, Josh Shapiro, that they were approving what they called a vent and burn of 5 of the train cars that contained vinyl chloride. They were going to vent it off and they were going to purposely burn it because they were concerned that there could be just sort of an uncontrolled explosion. And they were ordering an immediate evacuation of all residents within a 1 by 2 mile radius of the derailment site. So it was a pretty scary moment.
And what did we know about vinyl chloride in that moment?
It's a known carcinogen, a known human carcinogen. It's also very commonly used. It's used to make a polyvinyl chloride, which is PVC. Yeah, we use it in our plumbing. We use it in medical devices. It's very commonly used. And frankly, it's being used more and more. So transport of it has actually increased significantly over time. But we've also known since the 1970s that people exposed to vinyl chloride at high levels, like workers in plants where they make where they make PVC, some of them passed out. And it was found even back then in like 1974 that researchers were able to identify liver disease or at the time they called it liver abnormalities among workers at plants where they were making PVC. It took until like 2010 until they finally saw that it was liver disease. I think they just didn't sort of have the language for it, is what I understand from researchers.
Yeah.
And then in 2010, it was kind of identified as liver disease. And now there's testing going on to see if not just at high levels, but at low level exposures, how does exposure to vinyl chloride affect humans and other animals?
Julie, something that we've been struck by with your reporting, because, you work for a Pittsburgh news outlet, but y'all cover stuff all over our region. I know you yourself live in Ohio
Mhm.
and you've been to East Palestine many times. What has it been like for folks that have kind of lived in the shadow of this and have stories about things like vinyl chloride, from when this first happened, but also now?
Yeah, I guess the one story that's really stuck with me the most is a young mother, Zhuzha Janice. She and her 9-year-old son. I mean, she told me the story and it was just heart-wrenching. The night of the derailment, they were sitting there crafting in their living room. She's like, they're up late for him, and they see flames out the window and start trying to figure out what the heck is going on. They wind up going outside to take a look. And she's like, we went outside and we were like, oh my gosh, this is really bad. So they rush back in their house. He eventually falls asleep at maybe I think she said 3 a.m. She hears this very loud sound from his room, rushes in. She's like, it smells like a closet where bleach has spilled. He's coughing. He's projectile vomiting. He's begging for water. And she feels something in her body going on too. And she's like, oh my gosh, this is dangerous. We got to get out of here. They hop in the car. They drive to a hotel that's near where her son's grandmother lives in Chippewa, Pennsylvania, and stayed the night there. She said the next morning he woke up, he seemed okay, and they spent the weekend there. And then she described sort of the afternoon when, right after the vent and burn happened, again, they were still 20 miles away. She walks outside and she described just like a black wall of smoke, or a black wall of sort of vapor kind of thing, where she just got scared and went back in. And she was like, look, we all need to get out of here. So they got in the car and they drove even further into Pennsylvania, I think.
How long did they have to stay away? Did she ever go home?
I mean, she went back to get her mail and stuff, but she said they tried to go back to their apartment and couldn't. She just said the smell was just so strong. They just couldn't stay there. She said anytime she goes back into East Palestine, this was, in the year afterward, she would get a headache. She would not feel well. So they really have stayed away. And now they're settled elsewhere. They've moved.
How common do you think that is, from folks you've talked to, from your reporting? Like, how changed do you think this community really is?
The people I do hear from, it sounds like, life is forever changed. I mean, a good number of people have moved away. The entire community pretty much is involved in a lawsuit. Last fall, there was a class action settlement, 50,000 area residents, but that included people up to 20 miles away. It was a $600 million settlement with East Palestine approved by the court last fall, where some people like Zhuzha Janice, she could get, because she lives so close within a half mile of the site, she could get up to like $70,000 in the class action. Other people who are further away, say if you're like 10 or 20 miles away, you might only get a few $100s. But yeah, she hasn't seen any of that, for example. She also thinks most of that money will wind up going to pay 18 months, I think she said, of hotel bills that she had. So she doesn't really think she'll wind up making much from that.
Today's show is sponsored by the Frick Pittsburgh Museum and Gardens and a new award-winning tour of their historic home, Clayton. It's called Gilded, Not Golden, and this is unlike any tour you might have taken there in the past because it really gets into the complexities of Henry Clay Frick's story and legacy, like his role in the Homestead Riot and his lasting impact on our environmental health. It all focuses on the year 1892, when the riot happened, when Frick was almost assassinated, and when he mourned the loss of 2 of his children. I got to go on the new tour recently, and I was surprised by the way it started. You step into that glorious entryway and hear music from the orchestrion, that giant machine that sounds like an entire orchestra. It sets a very grand vibe. But as the music played, our tour facilitator told us how this one item was worth years of wages for a steelworker. And it became clear this tour wouldn't shy away from topics like wealth inequality and labor struggles. History is complicated, and that's what the Frick wants to share with you. The Frick's new signature tour of Clayton, Gilded, Not Golden, is now open for the season. Get tour tickets and learn more at thefrickpittsburgh.org.
Ready to conquer your next big challenge? Make 2025 your medal year by signing up for the Dick's Sporting Goods Pittsburgh Marathon weekend of events. Happening May 3rd and 4th in Pittsburgh, it's more than a marathon. Choose from a marathon, relay, 5K, and more. And if you prefer walking, join the popular half-marathon walking division. The Pittsburgh Marathon isn't just about running. It's about community, celebration, and pushing yourself to new limits. Over 300,000 fans will be cheering you on through the streets of the Steel City. And the hardest step is the first one, signing up. A registration today is a commitment to your future self. Join the excitement by visiting thepittsburghmarathon.com. Use CityCast15 to save 15% off any event registration. That's thepittsburghmarathon.com. And again, use that code, CityCast15, for 15% off any event.
So let's talk about these chemicals and where they ended up, because I think that kind of speaks to the impact that they've had on the community on this larger spill radius. What do we know?
From the beginning, the Environmental Protection Agency was pretty much telling people that the air quality was safe. I mean, right after the derailment, they were being told the air was safe. And within 2 days after that vent and burn of the chemicals, the evacuation order was lifted and people were allowed to come home. But I spoke with people at a community meeting. You know, one mother told me they came home after the evacuation order, went to sleep. The next morning, her young daughter woke up with like a swollen eye, like swollen down her face. And they went to the doctor and they called it like chemical pink eye, and they had no idea what to do.
Yeah.
Like, meaning the doctor didn't know what to do. So in those early weeks, the days and weeks after the derailment, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they had a team that was going door to door, surveying residents for health symptoms. There was also a medical clinic that opened, and they were putting out surveys to residents, something called an assessment of chemical exposures, an ACE survey. Mm-hmm. And I guess one thing that a lot of people have talked about was, you know, the CDC's own agents, while they were walking around the community, they got sick and they had to leave for a while. They were fine, but just like they were exposed also.
And sounds like they needed to take the survey too.
Right. So it was like later in the summer, maybe June, the CDC held a meeting to release the results of that survey in East Palestine. And they kind of explained that they had heard from a little over 700 residents. You know, many of them reported headaches, coughing, difficulty breathing, sinus congestion, and other symptoms that they felt were directly related to the derailment and the chemical exposures.
Yeah.
And so one of the other questions that came up was sort of when people went to their doctors, the doctors really weren't sure how to help people. Do they just treat the symptoms, or is there something they should do because these were potentially issues that were coming up because of chemical exposures? We found this webinar that was hosted by the Pennsylvania Department of Health. This was a couple of weeks after the incident, where health providers were asking for advice, like, should they be testing residents, their blood or their urine, for chemical exposures? And the Pittsburgh Poison Center, backed up by the CDC, said, no, just treat the symptoms. Don't test the urine or the blood to find out if people have been exposed. Their thinking, from what they said, was these chemicals move quickly through the body within 48 hours. They're mostly moved through things like vinyl chloride, another chemical, butyl acrylate, that was contaminating the community. And so they didn't think there was really anything to be done, even if people were exposed. So that was the advice given to local doctors. That was frustrating for a lot of residents I spoke with because they wanted to know.
I understand, like, from a medical perspective, like, fine, there's nothing you can do, but like, you still want to know. You want to know what your own personal exposure level is, especially like for maybe the future. I don't know.
Well, that's exactly right, Megan. I mean, and that's what people were saying at that same meeting that I mentioned, where the CDC released the results of that ACE survey, of the health symptoms survey. Mm-hmm. There were people there who had been able to get, for example, urine sampling. You know, Zhuzha Jenis, who we heard from earlier, that mom, she had her son's urine analysis. And there were other parents there, too, who were saying, look, this shows that we have the markers for vinyl chloride in our bodies. And the CDC toxicologist was like, well, we don't think those tests are often, they're often incorrect, for one. And also, there's really nothing to be done about it. And what that toxicologist advised people at that meeting was like, keep in touch with your medical provider, because if you wind up developing liver cancer, we know how to treat liver cancer.
Which is just like devastating news to hear that, like, good luck, or like tell your provider so that they know to be on the watch for something like cancer down the road. Like, to be left with that and have to sit with it has got to be so frustrating for residents. I guess, what have you learned maybe since those early days and months in terms of how researchers and others are kind of looking at this?
Yeah, I counted at least 10 research projects that were going on, some through like the National Institutes of Health. There has not been sort of a community-wide like real assessment of exposures and what sort of the subsequent health issues might be, but there are separate different kinds of studies being done. So, for example, one study that's gotten a lot of attention was a research project where they looked at the air quality inside some of the nearby buildings, and they found chemicals in those buildings that the EPA and that Norfolk Southern's contractors had missed. There have been other studies that look at sort of vinyl chloride and some of the other chemicals and whether or not they break down in the water. So this is sort of a precursor to understanding if those chemicals could find their way through, say, Sulphur Run or some of the other waterways that run through East Palestine, through the soil and into people's drinking water wells. And then one study that's just getting started is from the University of Pittsburgh. It's a federally funded study looking at vinyl chloride exposure and liver disease. So I think I started mentioning this earlier, that, in the 70s, they found that chemical plant workers were exposed to high levels of vinyl chloride, developed liver abnormalities, and then later that was found to be a specific liver disease that developed because of exposure to vinyl chloride. And now Julianne Beyer, who's a medical researcher at Pitt, is looking to see if low-level sort of chronic exposure enhances liver disease. They did this with mice. They dosed mice with levels of vinyl chloride that are currently considered safe in the U.S. and found 100% of them developed tumors, and 80% of those tumors were malignant, like malignant liver disease. Mm-hmm. So now she's starting to work with, I think she said, 300 residents in East Palestine. They're testing the air inside and outside. They're testing the water inside and outside their homes. And they're also testing their liver function. And they're going to track them over a period of years to see. And she, the prediction is, or the theory is, that those who have, more exposure to vinyl chloride will have faster developing liver disease if they get liver disease.
Yeah. I mean, how are people dealing with that? Like, I mean, I can see opting in, I can see opting out, but like either way, just knowing it to be a thing that you might deal with someday, like that's got to be really heavy.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is. I think that's why we're seeing, additional lawsuits, that people are frustrated and they just, they feel like they should have been better protected. And after it happened, they feel like the government should have had their back more and sort of helped them track things more carefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, what about the accountability piece? Like, I remember in the early days, like folks talking about like, we can set different safety standards because I think a lot of people have talked really openly about this being to some extent a really preventable thing. What happened with all of those? Like, did anything actually pass? Did anything change?
Yeah. So the National Transportation Safety Board, this is an independent governmental agency, and they have no regulatory authority, but they investigated this incident and found that the derailment was caused by an overheated wheel bearing. This is a common cause of derailments. The way I understand it is there's a system of detectors along the track. It's intended to warn the crew when to stop the train before like a hot bearing would like sort of separate the axle and cause a derailment. So in this case, the crew didn't get the warning in time, and so the NTSB found a couple of things about those hot bearing detectors. One is that they can misleadingly indicate lower temperatures than actually exist. And also that like in this case, they were just spaced too far apart.
Yeah, but I mean, you can only act on the information that you have at hand, right? Which I think that, I mean, that's part of your other reporting is that, the NTSB also found that Norfolk Southern withheld some key information during like the pivotal moments of all of this.
So the cause for the derailment was found to be the hot bearing detectors. But sort of the decision to vent and burn the chemicals, now that's a whole different issue, right? So Ohio Governor Mike DeWine and the incident commander, which was the local fire chief, they were the ones who had to decide whether or not to approve the vent and burn. And they did that with incomplete information. And the NTSB found that was because Norfolk Southern didn't provide it. The company, Oxy Vinyls, which actually owned the vinyl chloride, had taken temperatures in the rail cars that were of concern and found the temperatures were actually decreasing and had stabilized. But the information that was going to the decision makers was that it was increasing and that there was concern it could go through this very quick chemical process called polymerization and could explode. So, the NTSB said the vent and burn was actually not necessary.
Has Norfolk Southern addressed any of this? Have they acknowledged anything, like any kind of fault or made any of these changes that have been recommended?
So the Village of East Palestine and Norfolk Southern agreed just in the past week on a $22 million settlement. But the company says that this is not an admission of guilt. Last fall, a court also approved a $600 million settlement stemming from a class action lawsuit against Norfolk Southern. It was about 50,000 residents that signed on to this suit. They all live within a 20-mile radius of the derailment site, and those that are closest potentially are eligible for up to $70,000 of compensation, while those further away might get a few $100s.
And there's different amounts for like residents versus businesses and things like that. I actually have extended family that are within the radius and going through this process.
Yeah. Have they gotten any money from it so far?
No, they've been told amounts, but I think their confidence level and whether they're actually going to see any of it wanes with every day.
Yeah, and I guess because some residents have appealed the class action, like half of the settlement money is on hold during that appeal process. So that's, I think, might be part of it. There also, in recent days, there's like some 9 other lawsuits have been filed by individuals and businesses. I understand a pipe manufacturer, a dog kennel who says the dogs died in their kennel, a winery, and they're claiming like the $600 million class action settlement does not offer nearly enough compensation and is it not enough? Because I guess the idea is that the company would be incented not to change their practices to prevent a future derailment because it just costs them so much. But they're saying this just isn't enough money to do that. And I guess I also would want to mention there's one lawsuit that represents close to 750 residents against Norfolk Southern. And they're alleging for the first time that people died because of the derailment. And this contains the first 7 wrongful death claims against Norfolk Southern, including the death of a 1-week-old baby.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess this week marks 2 years. I imagine we're going to be hearing about complications from this for a while yet. I guess I want to know what you're going to be watching for as someone who's been committed to this community for a while now.
Yeah, I guess one thing I'm definitely watching is the rail safety bill. So the NTSB, when they did their investigation, made more than 34 recommendations on how to improve rail safety. As I said, they are not a regulatory body, but they can push for change, and that's what I imagine they're doing. What they said, they'll be lobbying for change. There was a rail safety bill in Congress in the past couple of years that got a lot of attention right after the derailment, but that stalled and that did not pass. I understand a new bill is being introduced, and so we'll be watching to see what happens with that. Vice President J.D. Vance and the new EPA administrator are expected to visit East Palestine just actually as we are recording this. So we'll see if that kind of attention leads to action. And then in terms of the chemical vinyl chloride that's gotten the most attention from this, It's being transported along the rails in increasing amounts. And the EPA did announce late last year that it was going to be considering whether the agency needs to issue tougher safety standards for vinyl chloride. So I'll be watching to see what happens with that as well.
Julie, thank you so much for your reporting. Julie has done so much great work. You can find more at WHYY. You did a long piece for The Pulse, their health show over there, as well as, of course, the Allegheny Front here based in Pittsburgh. Julie, thank you. We really appreciate you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Megan.
A teeny update. Vice President J.D. Vance did visit East Palestine right after we recorded this with Julie. He promised that the community wouldn't be forgotten or left behind, but he did not share specifics about what that could mean or what it might look like. Meanwhile, a new study from a group that advocates for better rail safety warns that several Norfolk Southern bridges here in the Pittsburgh area are in serious or poor condition. We know what can happen to a bad bridge around here. Norfolk Southern also has proposals in the works to run double-stack trains through the north side. There's a lot going on. We will have links to all of this reporting in our show notes. That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from around the city. Talk to you soon. And the mic that won't get out of my mouth.